All right. Well, welcome everyone to the first talk in our Tuesday Scholar Ollie Talks series. It's been renamed slightly. I am Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and I am absolutely delighted to see all of you, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome our first speaker today, Coleen Rowley. Before I turn the podium over to Coleen, I want to give a special shout out and a thanks here to a loyal audience member named Bill Dennett. And would you stand up, please, Bill? And the reason that I want to do this is because 2 years ago, Bill came to me and said, you know who would make a really good speaker? That FBI lady from 9/11. And I thought, boy, is that a good suggestion. And I must say that Ms. Rowley was not an easy person to track down, so it took me a couple of years to find her, but I did. And so we are so delighted. For those of you who may not remember, Coleen Rowley was an FBI agent at the time of 9/11, and she was the original and most famous Minnesota whistleblower connected to 9/11 ever. So we are really honored to have her. Her appearance is made possible, in addition to the suggestion of Mr. Dennett, her appearance is made possible through Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, which provides financial backing for this series. And of course, we must acknowledge the huge contribution of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, OLLI, our partners in this series as in so many others. So thank you all very much. And now I'll turn the microphone over to Coleen Rowley. Thank you.
Well, this is amazing, and I hope that the people that are standing it's worth it on your legs this whole time. It's a very sad moment, of course, 17 years after the horrible, tragic attack on 9/11. Around 3,000 people died, and we all remember, it was so traumatic. Everybody was glued to their televisions for a period of time, and I got to know some of the victims of the attack, some of the widows that their husbands died, and they became some of the strongest advocates for truth after 9/11. One of the things that motivated me, and I ended up testifying to the Senate Judiciary because I was kind of forced to explain, especially to the FBI, why the heck did you write a memo about this 8.5 months after 9/11? Why did you put any of this in writing? And so I was actually under a certain amount of pressure just to explain why the truth was important. People, when you're in these official high-ranking rungs of things and you're involved in it and you've made mistakes that people have died as a result, there's almost inevitably going to be a cover-up. And I have found only a couple of occasions in officialdom where there really some truth did come out, and that was the Challenger and the Columbia. When those happened, because there were some generals with integrity and Sally Ride, the astronaut, whatever, and they did form a commission type thing. There's official reports of both the Columbia and the Challenger, and I think a lot of the truth came out. They admitted that they could have maybe even saved the astronauts on the Challenger if they had tried harder, etc. So, but that's really the exception, because as far as I know, in almost all other cases, what happens even when negligent mistakes are made, not even deliberate, but certainly if there's recklessness or whatever, and there's a lot of problems that have led up to something, everyone is reluctant to say what they did. And in a case where it's widespread, where there's a blame to go around because there's a lot of different people and entities, that's even worse, because everybody thinks, well, if I say what I did, then or if I point to somebody else and say, well, they made the mistake, then they'll point at somebody else, and the whole house of cards will come down. So it's not necessarily what you would call a conspiracy, but it's just human tendency not to really, for human beings not to tell the full truth after something terrible has happened. And then there's also what I write about up here, which is the Pearl Harbor problem. And when you have people that have been wishing for something bad to happen, and that was the case. There were some foreign policy officials and retirees who had been writing for a long time, if we just get our new Pearl Harbor, and the country then will be more able to be, in my opinion, to be manipulated, etc., we can boost the Pentagon, we can go to war on Iraq and Iran, and we can do all those things we wanted to do. And so, and I will just mention Rahm Emanuel. There's a book out called Shock Doctrine. Has anyone read that book by Naomi Klein? That's what it is. It's the shock doctrine. It's a famous book now. And basically, if you look at how change occurs, in many, many cases, it's because there's a tremendous shock and trauma, and that then allows the leaders, so-called leaders, then to do what they want to do. It's called shock doctrine, and Rahm Emanuel, who was a chief of staff for Clinton, he said, "Don't let any catastrophe go to waste." That's what his comment was. Any catastrophe go to waste, we will make use of it in a very, of course, opportunistic way. Yes?
I'm so sorry for interrupting, but some of us are having a hard time hearing because of the talking that's going on in the
Okay.
room. And also...
Am I too close to this?
No,
Oh.
I'm talking about the...
Okay.
There's too much talking going on in the room, and I, for one, am having a hard time hearing. Also, people, please turn off your cell phones.
Okay. I think, can people hear my voice, though, well enough? Okay. Okay. Thank you. So going back to this is a sad moment, and I almost want to have a moment of silence here, but then probably people would start talking again, because we're 17 years later, and frankly, not very much has changed, except if anything, it's gotten worse. We've gotten into a more and more risks to national security. Terrorism has grown exponentially, and even the violence, the level of mass shootings, and a lot of our domestic problems are related to this war. If you look at, somebody asked me a question before we started. They said, didn't bin Laden want to provoke the United States into doing stupid things and spending their debt up to $21 trillion? Wasn't that the plan all along? And absolutely, that was the plan. That was the plan of the terrorist leader, to try to make the United States make dumb decisions out of fear and not being able to think. And it seemed to succeed, because now fundamentalist extremism is actually far, far greater than it ever was on 9/11. So everything we're doing, and part of the reason for that is this top line here: a poor man's war is terrorism, while a rich man's terrorism is war. That's a quote that I often use, because if you're a weaker side, what you want to do is use unconventional means of warfare, exactly what the United States, George Washington did in fighting the much more powerful British. He used a form of guerrilla warfare, which we now call terrorism. Our founding fathers, the Revolutionary War was waged that way because we were less powerful. And what that does is that then provokes the powerful side to use more force on their side, and then the other side, and it just ratchets it up. That's what it does. War is not the answer to terrorism, and yet that was what was suggested after 9/11. I testified to, first, my memo was written to the Joint Intelligence Committee inquiry, and as a part of that, and then to the Senate, then I testified 2 weeks later to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and finally to the investigators of the Department of Justice's Inspector General. The problem, and I was not the only one, there were quite a number of, and especially here in Minnesota, good, honest FBI agents, NSA executives even, who told the truth. What they knew, the parts that they knew, they told the truth, and they became whistleblowers. There were 4 NSA whistleblowers because they had turned on warrantless monitoring illegally on American citizens after 9/11, and there were at least 4 NSA whistleblowers. The problem is we all did this. We all went through the channels and we all testified, and it was all more or less buried. And after, it took a long time, like this DOJ Inspector General report took over 2 years to come out. And so this is also a way, when the truth is delayed and over a 2.5 year period, the 9/11 Commission was the same way. That took about 2.5 years for that eventually to come out. And so when that's delayed, what happened in the meantime? Well, within the next day after 9/11, and we know this from books of people that were there in the room, Richard Clark and the other, Paul O'Neill. Is it Paul O'Neill? I think. O'Neill was his last name, at least. He was a Treasury Secretary. They were right in the room. And so Bush and the Bush administration, within a day, start saying, okay, now we can start war on Iraq. And so they started the war on Afghanistan first, but then immediately started doing the war on, or shilling for and concocting false intelligence, etc., for the war on Iraq. And and all of those were started long before the reports came out. Now here's one of the major things. Iran, there's a federal case and there's a federal judge that blamed Iran for 9/11. Do people know this? There is an official court case. Of course, the victims' families are like aghast. Iran had nothing to do. People got them confused. Iraq and Iran, what's the difference, you know? But Iran is a Shiite country. The terrorists were Sunni Wahhabi fundamentalists, mostly associated with Saudi Arabia and other Wahhabi areas. Iran is really considered their enemy in a way. They're the Shiites, and they're a little more liberal. There's different, versions of all of these things, but they had nothing to do with 9/11, and yet we have a federal court case that blamed, and actually they attached assets of Iran in this country for purposes of 9/11. So they lost some assets from that. Additionally, besides that, on the eve of the attack, or excuse me, the invasion of Iraq, March of 2003. Fast forward after all those months of Colin Powell holding up vials and chemical weapons, and Dick Cheney saying that Iraqi intelligence had met with Mohammed Atta, who was the kind of the ringleader of the Al-Qaeda terrorists. So all these lies that were going on for months and months. So you get to the eve of the Iraq War, and guess what? 70% of the American people were led to believe that Iraq was behind 9/11. Iraq was behind, same thing. Iraq was mostly Shiite country. Saddam Hussein was actually an enemy of these Wahhabi fundamentalist Saudi-connected people that attacked us, Al-Qaeda. It's incredible. So you see how this works with being able to manipulate people due to fear. It was pretty amazing. And those numbers of people that believed that 9/11 was caused as a result of Iraq and didn't know anything about Saudi Arabia's involvement, etc., that didn't go down real quickly. There were, after the news, after we actually started the war on Iraq, and then they couldn't find chemical weapons of mass destruction, then Tim Russert and other major media people were called on the carpet. The head of New York Times, Bill Keller, was called on. Like, where'd you get all this? All this stuff you were publishing on Iraq? And they said, and then they made up, well, it sounded like that. I mean, they all had their excuses. But they misled the people to believe, and 70% of the people believed Iraq was behind 9/11. So that this kind of thing, the truth really matters. Even if we were to have launched an actual global war on terror, which I don't think was the right approach in the FBI, what's the right approach if someone commits a violent act? Well, it's considered a crime. And so, they're even the war crimes in the Nazi era and stuff, that was considered a crime. And they went and tried to find these war criminals, and then they tried them in court and stuff. So we didn't do that. We just said, no, we're not going to treat 9/11 as a crime. And I argued this several times with different people, part of the administration, because they said, no, we're going to go to war. But even then, they went to war with the wrong countries. It's pretty. I mean, it's devastatingly, unbelievably bad. And our news is not really, even to this day, told us too much. The other thing that happened, besides the fact that they began to immediately plan this long-term war and wars that would successively take out countries, beginning with Afghanistan, then Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, Syria. There were 6 or 7 of them, and then the last one was Iran. And so far, that's kind of where we've stopped. But we're right on the edge now of finally starting war in Iran. So that was this whole plan. But besides that, the Office of Legal Counsel had a couple of very key attorneys. Most people know the one name, John Yoo. People know him because he's associated with the torture memo. It was actually more than one memo. He began to write memos right after 9/11. But he had a co-author, and his co-author was Robert Delahunty. Yes. And see, what it was is John Yoo was a newer guy, and kind of they paired up because Robert Delahunty was senior. And so I don't think Robert Delahunty, they're very close, by the way. John Yoo and Robert Delahunty to this day co-author books about what's called, I wouldn't say, by the way, this is not conservative. I am also conservative on the Constitution. But this, in my opinion, is a radical, it's called the imperial presidency or war presidency powers. And in the old days, during the Civil War and in other wars, it was called martial law. That means that the president, in a time of war, gets to ignore the Constitution. And one of the very first memos that John Yoo and Robert Delahunty wrote, my colleague here could look it up if anyone's interested. I should just mention my colleague was a defense attorney JAG at Guantanamo. And so he's like the expert on all of this law stuff. But during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln did the same thing. And they threw editors. There was no freedom of press. If you were an editor criticizing the Abraham Lincoln's army and stuff, generals were allowed to put you in jail for writing op-eds saying that this was wrong. Even people that were writing family members across the line were put in jail and stuff. So what happens, they could seize property. A lot of things that cannot happen in a time without war are allowed to happen when you're at war. And many legal scholars kind of thought that was in the past. They didn't think that those would be brought out again because they lead to all kinds of problems. And even some of Lincoln's usurping some of these powers was later, the Supreme Court later kind of rebuked it all. And so it was kind of believed that this would never happen again. But immediately after 9/11, there are memos that John Yoo writes that say, we no longer will necessarily have our First Amendment rights. And we will no longer maybe have our Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Well, within a few days after 9/11, the NSA turned on those buttons where they were monitoring everybody. So that was illegal, unless you say we're in a time of war and it's a form of martial law. So that was going on. Now, none of us, even including myself, the other thing, of course, was they began to set the groundwork for torturing. And so there was a whole series of memos, including one written in February before the actual real torture memo that says you can do everything up to death or organ damage, and it's not considered torture, which is the one John Yoo wrote. But before that, in February of 2002, John Yoo wrote one, or they wrote one that said the Geneva Conventions no longer apply. And so if the Geneva Conventions no longer apply, what do the Geneva Conventions protect us against? Torture. And so that was told to the military, and then you had these abuses beginning very quickly after 9/11. So I'm going to go to my next thing here. And by the way, those articles I have, well, I'm missing one here, but if you miss something I say or whatever, I've written this article for the Ethics Intelligence Journal entitled War on Terror, A False Solution. And so you can Google it, and it's kind of long. It would have been long to copy, but...
Say something, actually, there were a stack of those articles. They've already been distributed. I have the text document, so if anybody wants to email me, my card is up here on the table. Just email me, and I will send you back by email the other article.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's the article. I'm much better on paper than I am verbally, maybe like my president. I feel sorry for him in some ways because I can do it better in writing, and you can take your time and you can be more precise, etc. So I've written about these things a lot, and I want to go now, though, to the story here in Minnesota. We had in August 16th, or 14th or 15th, the day before, two calls came in from a flight school in Eagan. And these were whistleblower pilot instructors. They were going against their own company. Their company said, keep your mouth shut. We have this most suspicious flight student we've ever had. He paid in cash. He couldn't explain why he wanted to learn to fly. And then there's actually 20-some pages of facts that were so suspicious. Well, these two flight instructors called us separately. They didn't even know the other one was calling. And they landed on one of our best agents, but he was a young agent because he had been himself in aviation in the military. I think he was in the Marines or something, or Navy. He was a Navy aviator. And so he called, and plus he had a background in terrorism because our office here had just started up a joint terrorist task force, one of the first in the country. So they called in, and they land on him. He was like, oh, wow. And he got an INS agent. They followed up on it quickly. Within the next day, they went out to the flight school. They talked to the actual instructor who verified everything that had come in. And then they determined that it was so dangerous. Now, you would never have known this from Condi Rice saying, no one would ever know a plane would fly into a building. And she said this, and many other officials said the same thing after 9/11. On August 16th, this Moussaoui was his name, French-Moroccan, was taken into custody. And you know what? He was suspected of interference with aviation, and the other one was a terrorist charge. They were the exact same two charges that years later he was charged with, and he got a life imprisonment for it because he was connected to the other Al-Qaeda people. So after 9/11, of course, no one wanted to talk about the fact that there was somebody in custody already for 3.5 weeks, and why didn't you do anything when you knew this? And then, of course, it turns out it wasn't just Moussaoui, because a Phoenix FBI agent in July, and before this, he wrote the memo in July, before this had noticed many terrorists training in flight schools. And he had sent a memo in. And the memo said 7-8 pages, and it said, look at all this. And he had big, documented histories of these terrorists training in flight schools. And his last sentence says, extremely urgent. The FBI must check out all flight schools right away. That memo came into the FBI headquarters on July 10th or 11th of 2001. Plenty of time. That would have been 2 months beforehand. And then we actually do find one training in flight school here. Okay? No one ever even read, or they claim they didn't read these memos. Can you believe this? The Phoenix memo was addressed to people at headquarters, and they deny ever having read it after 9/11. One person, like an analyst, did read it, but only one analyst read it, and the rest of the supervisors deny having read it. And of course, these were the same supervisors that knew about the Moussaoui case. There was such a reluctance to act on the information that was, the agents requested an emergency search warrant under the FISA law. And there's, people think, well, the FISA law, there's an emergency exception. So if you have an emergency, you can actually just do it this quickly. You just have to get a judge and you say it's emergency, and a day later then you have to put all the facts, or a couple days later you have a couple of days. So they requested an emergency exception in order to search Moussawi's belongings, whatever. And our headquarters had all these reasons, you know, but they read the document, but they verbally briefed people. They didn't even allow the higher-ups to read it. There was verbal briefings that went on. So and then of course there's a third part of the FBI. I'm only talking about the FBI. I'm not talking about NSA's failures or CIA's failures, and most of those to this day we don't know a whole lot about, because they didn't have, like the CIA, for instance, I don't think had any whistleblowers. So to this day we don't know the problems with the CIA, but we can guess at some of them, because the CIA had been monitoring this group of Al-Qaeda operatives since an important meeting in Kuala Lumpur that occurred about 2 years before, something like that. I can't remember the exact dates. They never told the FBI about it, but they'd been following these people. Well, they knew that 2 of them, of the people that had met in Kuala Lumpur, were coming to California. And at one point, they actually did know that one of them, of the 2, came into California. And yet, we start ticking off the time before 9/11. There was never a notification to the FBI until, I think it was just a few days or before 9/11, they finally tell the FBI that this Al-Qaeda terrorist is in California. And now they're trying to desperately find that person. And to this day, we don't know how and why that happened. We have an agent, actually 2 agents, that wrote memos, because they were in the CIA, they were temporarily assigned, and they wrote memos trying to notify the FBI, and those memos were stopped. And so the FBI never even learned that 2 of the terrorists were in California. And there's a lot more to that maybe I'll have time to go into, but going back to the story here, this terrible mischance that former New York Times reporter Philip Sheenan, and he became quite an expert on 9/11 because he wrote this book called The Commission. It's a big, thick book. I have it at home, and I haven't really ever read it because it's pretty daunting. But he followed every single, every bit of that commission case, the 9/11 Commission, and he finds out, actually years later, I want to say 2013 or 14 is when this memo was written. It took a long time even for him to learn. But there was a memo, I'll show it to you, that said, okay, I'll come back to this. Let's see, that's the memo. This is the memo itself. And you maybe can't read it, but it says Director Free, who was the FBI director at the time, and it says, Bin Laden and Ibn Khattab threat reporting. And a little bit of blacked out there, but it says in there, they are heavily entwined. Ibn Khattab was a Chechen terrorist. They're also the same, more or less very closely related to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda aligned. And during Charlie Wilson's war, which is when we had this brilliant idea that we would arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, and we gave them Stinger missiles, and we kind of trapped the Soviet Union. Zbigniew Brzezinski did it at the time, and they trapped the Soviet Union, and they gave the Mujahideen. Frontline did a great documentary on this. So there's a little bit of truth about this Charlie Wilson's War. Charlie Wilson's War. How many people have seen that movie? Okay, what Charlie Wilson's War needed was the sequel, because it ended on such a high note, because, Brzezinski's plan worked, and the Soviet Union exhausted itself, and, in fighting these groups of Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and it was part of the reason how the Soviet Union collapsed. And so everybody, at the end of Charlie Wilson's War, he gets an award, a prize, because, his plan worked. It wasn't just his, it was others. But the truth is there's a sequel to it, and the sequel is 9/11. Because this group of Mujahideen was Al-Qaeda, was what became the Taliban in Al-Qaeda. So we were the ones arming them and funding them in Afghanistan. But you'll never, other than the Frontline documentary told the truth about it, but you hardly ever hear an official mention that, we made this mistake because we were on helping the terrorists. And then, of course, they turn against you. Bin Laden turned against us for a couple of reasons. So going back to this memo, they were working together, Ibn Khattab, the Chechen, and Bin Laden. Now, when the information was sent, pages of facts that they got from the pilot instructor of Moussaoui was sent to Great Britain, and it was sent to France because he was French-Moroccan. France, do you know anything about this? It was sent right away. They worked overnight. It was sent there. They fell on we call them legal attachés, but FBI agents that are in embassies. He ran it to the French right away, to the French law enforcement and the French, equivalent of their intelligence agencies, and they looked at it and they said, "Oh, wow!" And they sent right back. It's just a few days later. They sent back that Moussaoui was recruiting for Ibn Khattab, and actually he had even recruited one of his friends who had been killed in fighting in Chechnya. So, this piece of information was put immediately into the facts, and yet headquarters, who cares? We don't know. This memo that existed, if you see the date up there, it's April 2001. And again, the supervisors and the officials at FBI headquarters, even though their names are right there, these are all like assistant directors at the bottom. One to Picard, he became the acting FBI director. One to Rollins, but their names are right down there. They claim they never saw it. Okay, I think you might see where I'm going with this. And I'm not the only person, the 9/11 Commission says 9/11 was a failure. What did they say? It was a failure to connect the dots. It was a failure to read information, for starters, just to read it. Then to share information, because the agencies were not sharing they weren't sharing information inside the agencies, let alone between agencies. And then third, to act on the information. And maybe the most egregious failure to act on information was George Tenet was the director of Central Intelligence, that he was CIA director, but this was before they formed the National Intelligence Center and everything. After 9/11, they formed this center, and now they have an intelligence czar director. But before that, it was George Tenet. The CIA director was the director of Central Intelligence. He was supposed to be overseeing all the intelligence community. Well, on August 23rd, he was briefed with two slides entitled "Fundamentalist Learns to Fly." And that was a slide about Moussaoui, and it had all of the suspicious things about him. It was just 2 slides, and it just had some bare bones. And we don't know who else he might have briefed about that, but we know it went up to the very top. Even though the FBI didn't care and they weren't reading it, the head of the whole thing, George Tenet, knew about this on August 23rd, 2001. And in fact, on the morning of 9/11, he's having breakfast with his mentor in Oklahoma, and someone runs in and says a plane has hit the World Trade Center, and the first thing out of George Tenet's mouth is, "Oh, I wonder if it's the guy in Minnesota." And that one newspaper article caught him saying that, so it was kind of known. Later, when he has to testify to the 9/11 Commission, he's asked, "Well, why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you act on this information that you knew of the information from Minnesota?" And he just kind of shrugs and says, "Well, I didn't think it was my job." And in theory, he's CIA, we're the FBI, so I thought the FBI would handle it. That was his excuse. So, but this memo was very key, because if they had read it, they all now say, including Rollins, who was the boss of the supervisors, he says if he would have seen this memo, it would have changed everything. Because then he would have known that Ibn Khattab and Bin Laden were entwined. Because one of the arguments was that the Chechen terrorist group was not a real terrorist group. Partly because we always use these groups as proxy forces. And in Chechnya especially, you know what, they're fighting the Soviets and whatever, so when you're using them, you're kind of loath to put them on a terrorist list. And we've had to take other terrorist groups off our list in order to use them. We took an Iranian mech group, Mujahideen Khalq, under Hillary Clinton. We took them off the list, even though they'd killed Americans and everything. Why? Because we're using them now in Iran to assassinate, etc. So we had to take them off and on these terrorist lists. And so that's probably one of the reasons why they didn't want to go too far with the fact that bin Laden and Ibn Khattab were connected. But anyways, nobody even claims or says that they even read the memo, and it would have made a big difference. Now I'm going to go back here if I can find it. So one of the conversations in the lead up to 9/11, the FBI agents, not me, I was just the legal counsel in the office. And so I knew these agents were tearing their hair out. I would talk to them a little bit in the hallways, and I knew that they were trying desperately, and I knew all of these shenanigans that were going on. And of course, they were trying to go up to the boss to call the boss. You always have to go up echelons in these hierarchies. But the Minneapolis office didn't have our special agent in charge had just retired, and so there wasn't anyone with this sufficient clout to make the call into headquarters to say, hey, why are you giving a runaround to these agents? They found a terrorist suspect here. And so that was one of the problems. But during one of these conversations, I want to say August 28th, the supervisor is our supervisor, Minneapolis supervisor, is on the phone, and he is trying to make them desperately see what is the risk here. And he actually said on the phone, don't you know, this is a guy who could fly into the World Trade Center. He said this in August of 2001. And yet, Condi Rice and Robert Mueller and George Tenet and all of those officials, of course, they're all planning nefarious other things that had nothing to do with 9/11, and they desperately don't want the truth to come out. They all go out in front of cameras in the days after 9/11 and said, no one could have known or done anything to prevent this. They said, Condi said nobody would know a plane could fly into a building, even though Condi Rice was involved in training exercises, where that was part of the thing. That was part of the narrative that they were planning for. And yet she went in front of cameras and said these things. And our agent had actually presently said this is a guy who could fly into a World Trade Center. Now he wrote it, he had proof because when they were keeping notes of everything, and he actually wrote that down in his notes. And the guy at headquarters says, I don't remember that. So most of what the answer is on all of these things is don't remember that. Our acting director tried to tell Attorney General Ashcroft in July to, be more concerned about terrorism. Make it the top priority. Why? Because they were being flooded with intelligence. Not just that last memo I told you, April 2001, that was one. But there were other memos that were just flooding in, saying that, we were going to suffer an attack. Now, we had already suffered attacks. The embassies in Africa had been bombed. The Cole Navy ship had been bombed. And by the way, that was all the same people that were connected. The Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia had been bombed. A Minnesotan died in the Khobar Towers bombing in the late 90s. And that was covered up by Louis Freeh. He said the same thing. Iranians did it. And it almost certainly was al-Qaeda. They were trying to kick the United States military out of Saudi Arabia. So there had been these other attacks, and plus they were getting all this intelligence, to the point where the 9/11 Commission, the chapter about all of this intelligence coming in, is entitled, The System Was Blinking Red. That's the title of the chapter. Now just remember, it didn't come out till about 3 years too late. But that's the name of the chapter, and they said that Richard Clark, who was the intelligence director, and George Tenet, who was the head of all counterterrorism and all intelligence in the United States, they said their hair was on fire. Their hair was on fire, they were getting so much. And Richard Clark says, I was calling him daily about this. Richard Clark was pleading with Condi Rice. He tried pleading. He's written a whole book about it. And he went on 60 Minutes. He was pleading with her to have a meeting about trying to stop terrorism. And yet, after 9/11, no one would have known, no one would have known that that a plane could fly into a building. That's the end of, there's more, this is that end of that memo. The reason, by the way, I'm not leaking a classified document. The only case that went to court, and it's the reason we know any of this, that's the only reason Philip Sheenan found out about this narrow mischance, is because one of the terrorist suspects, and really of all of them, has been tried in federal court as a crime, as a regular crime, instead of this war on terror. And that person was Moussaoui. And there were 260, or maybe it's even more than that, but a few hundred exhibits that came out in that trial. And this was an exhibit in Moussaoui's trial. And people didn't even notice it until Philip Sheenan found it. You know, it's one of hundreds of exhibits. But that's the only way that we learned anything about the truth of this, because otherwise, in a war, it remains classified. Intelligence remains classified for almost forever. There are things from sinking the Lusitania that are still classified. So if you don't have a federal trial, it's one of the ways that you learn things. Okay, so one of the things that's been covered up for a significant period of time, and this did get some news coverage, so you might well know about it, was called the 28 pages. The Joint Intelligence Committee produced a couple of reports. They had, I think, a pretty good Pentagon analyst who produced this preliminary report. Her name was Eleanor, can't remember her last name, but she was pretty good. And she produced a report pretty quickly, too. This is where I first testified to the Joint Intelligence Committee. But when she testified and gave this first preliminary report of the Joint Intelligence Committee, she actually said, before I start, I got to tell you, I was not allowed to go up very high. You know, here I am, whatever her rank is, you know, it's colonel or something, I don't know, but it's not as high as the president. And so she was stopped and could not go above that level. And so she actually said, you know, I'll tell you what I know, but I was not allowed to question the president or any of these people. And she did a fair job. And actually, in the course of the Joint Intelligence Committee, they had found out that some of the funding for the hijackers and the support for the hijackers, I told you 2 of them came into California, and it was all secret from the FBI until too late. But they were helped. And who were they helped by? Finding apartments. They were helped giving money, different things. And I think they even attended a mosque that al-Awlaki was involved in, etc. Well, they were helped by, the 9/11 pages doesn't say exactly this. They just have the facts down about money going, and one of the money goes from Bandar bin Sultan, who's like a nephew. He's a very high level in the Saud family. He's been an ambassador in the United States for decades, and he was close friends with the Bush family. And in fact, his nickname was Bandar Bush. His Bandar bin Sultan, but his nickname was Bandar Bush because he was so close with him. And, you know, they did favors for each other and etc. And anyways, there's money that flows from his wife. It's kind of circuitous right to these terrorist suspects. And then there's other Saudi officials. And if you really research this now, they've done a pretty good job of learning that some of the Saud family, of course, are fundamentalist Wahhabi people, and that they were helping the terrorists. Now, this was all covered up. Now, the head of our Senate committee that did the Joint Intelligence Committee was Bob Graham. And Bob Graham has written a whole book about this as well. You know, the good thing is, one of the reasons I can speak a little freely now is that this isn't Coleen Rowley speaking from my experience. There's books written about it now. Very few people in the United States know it because our media suppresses all of this. But in fact, there are books, and these officials who lived and breathed it, including Bob Graham, he was a longtime senator, and he was furious because when these 28 pages that document, on the veranda, sitting on the veranda, it's Dick Cheney, Bandar bin Sultan, Condi Rice, and Bush. And the only thing is, it almost looks like they're having a drink or something on the veranda. And I always wondered, when was this photo taken? Was it taken after 9/11 where they're like sitting there? I don't know when it was taken, but this is a pretty incredible thing where they're all like having a conversation. Going back to the 28 pages, Bob Graham was furious that this was squashed, completely squashed and censored. It was completely blacked out. And so it was really the only thing that's blacked out of the report. And the families then have to fight because they are trying through lawsuits to sue, responsible parties, and some of the families are trying to sue Saudi Arabia. And they tried, the court says, no evidence, no evidence. Well, of course, the evidence is blacked out. So their suit was dismissed a couple of times. Finally, in 2016, I think, or 17, they finally get Congress to pass a law called the JASTA, J-A-S-T-A, which stands for, I should remember these acronyms, but it's fighting terrorism, whatever, and it allows families to sue Saudi Arabia. No other foreign country, but Saudi Arabia. It made one exception. And one of the reasons for that is Graham and others were finally getting through to the media, and it was creating some pressure. So Congress passed this law, and then Obama vetoed it. He'll say, well, I don't want to create bad foreign relations with Saudi Arabia, so we can't, let these pages come out. And then, of course, they downplay. They say it's meaningless. When it goes to the 9/11 Commission, the writer of the 9/11 Commission report, Zelikow, deliberately canned it. He didn't want to hear about it, and it was never investigated. And he fired a couple of the investigators that were looking into this thing. They were let go. So it's obviously that this was pretty important, that it was that Saudi Arabia officials, some Saudi Arabia officials, and by the way, Moussaoui says this too now. The lawyers for these families have been able to interview him in prison, in Supermax prison, and I don't know how much of this could be true or not. He certainly has a motive, and he was not seen as real stable anyways. Plus, then he's been in Supermax prison forever, so heaven knows how much of this could be true. But he verified that Bin Laden was actually conducting fundraising from top Saudis, and it would stand to reason because Bin Laden came from a respected, wealthy family in Saudi Arabia, and the Wahhabi religion is the official state religion. So it wasn't like he was a rogue. Bin Laden was not necessarily considered a rogue in Saudi Arabia. And it would not be surprising if top Saudi government officials were helping Al-Qaeda. And yet, it still remains, the families have collected a lot more evidence on this. And we have hope that if this case goes forward and isn't dismissed a third time, that maybe some more truth will come out about it, but no one knows for sure. This is the, I don't think it says in here the name of it, but this is the JASTA, and after it passed in Congress, Saudi Arabia, of course, has lots of money. They actually would take Congress people and military people on junkets to Saudi Arabia to try to influence them so that they would not allow this case to go forward, and they've spent millions on lobbying and PR and everything else on this and trying to fight it. Okay, so at about 2, I'll stop for questions or so. Okay, this is 9/11 isn't and Charlie Wilson's war is not the only time that we have used proxy forces and don't tell the American public who we really are arming and funding. And the last case was Syria. The group that is the Al-Qaeda group in Syria, and it's one of the reasons Obama was hesitant. He had a lot of pressure, and to this day, there's a ton of pressure now on Trump to have all-out war in Syria. Why? Because it's on the list, and it's the country before Iran. And so there's been pressure on all these presidents, but Obama was hesitant. He at one time was pressured to bomb Syria, and he pulled back from it, but he was pressured. But this defense intelligence assessment did leak somehow. And it basically says, you know, we're on the side of the al-Nusra and the other terrorists in Syria. And the Assad government is, but this is what we want because we're trying to topple the Assad government. So we will use these proxy forces. Petraeus has given some foreign policy talks and whatever, and he says, well, maybe it's time to cozy up to al-Nusra now. They're better than ISIS. So when you create a terrorist group that's even worse than Al-Qaeda, now you can go out and say, well, maybe Al-Qaeda can be our friends because there's now even a worse group and we'll fight them. But the truth is these terrorist groups have mushroomed. They've mushroomed, and you know, they call it whack-a-mole. So one mushroom's up who's worse than the others, and you have to hit that one down, and then another one comes up. And as long as our foreign policy and this whole thing does not change, I think that we will continue to see an increase in terrorism. It'll just be new groups. They can call themselves new names. In Syria, they changed their names a million times. You can't even keep up with the new names. And part of that reason is that, you know, it's to kind of fool everybody, so you don't recognize the name anymore. They come up every week. They come up with a new name. But this defense intelligence estimate leaked because it did tell the truth about it. Well, this is just a nutshell by Andrew Bacevich, who was a Boston University historian. Has anyone heard him speak? He's been here 4 or 5 times. Yeah, he's written 4 or 5 books. You know, he really knows this stuff inside and out. And his own son got killed in Iraq as well. And he is really good. And this is kind of in a nutshell what went on here. And this effort to utopian globalism, where the United States would be the exceptional, indispensable leader of the world. The real problem now, and this is, you know, having read all these foreign policy things for years now, is that after 9/11, we had it relatively easy in launching wars on really defenseless countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia. You know, those countries don't even have military defenses. And so for Americans, it seemed pretty like war is easy. Even the first 2 were boots on the ground, Afghanistan and Iraq, but still a few, I think it's about 8,000 casualties. That's nothing compared to the casualties over there. You know, if you went by the Vietnam War standard, where you just count the number of people you kill and you say you're winning because you're killing, you know, millions of people, well, they killed, you know, 1 million or so in the Mideast, and maybe more, much more if you consider the chaos that got unleashed. But Americans had relatively little costs. And that's one of my articles about the recipe concocted for perpetual war, is after Vietnam, they realized that Vietnam syndrome, where people really understood that the Vietnam War had been a mistake and that what were we fighting for? They had this domino theory. It turned out not to be true. And in the meantime, you killed a lot of My Lai massacres and all the rest, and you killed a lot of Vietnamese peasants. But what was the purpose of it? And, you know, people had what they called a reluctance. John McCain, you know, would actually give speeches, and others did too. West Point generals would write essays about how to defeat Vietnam syndrome, so we can make the American public more gung-ho on launching wars. And, you know, that's one of the things. They were able, over time, to get the polls way down now. And this latest documentary with Burns Novick on the Vietnam War, they're trying to rehabilitate the Vietnam War so that it seems like we really did have a noble cause, etc. And so over time, that has gone down, and they defeated Vietnam syndrome, also, of course, getting rid of the draft. And the other big thing is no boots on the ground. So by merely concentrating on aerial bombing and drone bombing, there's, of course, very little casualties to the United States. And the other thing is a national debt that is just allowed to soar. And it's up to 21 trillion. Somebody asked me about the national debt before and saying that was bin Laden's idea to begin with. It's now up to 21 trillion with no end in sight. And so very, very dangerous for the United States in the scheme of things for national security, this kind of thing. But what does it do? Keeps Americans from knowing. James Madison had said back when he was writing the Constitution that, we'll never have standing armies because as soon as we levy taxes to pay for this military, and right now it's about $1 trillion a year, as soon as the Americans have to pay for this, they will say, it would come to about somewhere around $50,000, maybe even to $100,000 per taxpayer right now, per family, if we were to have paid for all of these wars. It's something like at least $7-8 trillion. And you divide it by, the taxpayers, and you get several, tens of thousands of dollars. Now, if a bill came, I would say even for 1/10 of that amount, tomorrow, we say, you know what, we're conservative, let's pay down some of this war debt, 21 trillion. Let's pay 1,000, you pay 1/100th of what they've cost. Wars would probably end tomorrow. How many people would pay $1,000, even a small fraction of what we now owe? But by having this sliding thing, so no one is aware of the fact that, the wars cost anything. And so it's pretty cost-free. That's part of my article that I wrote there. And it's also, how difficult it is, and this is why we're on this treadmill now of perpetual war. John McCain, when he ran, you remember he came here with Sarah Palin and campaigned a couple times, and he said that he didn't call it perpetual war. He said this war will last another 100 years. And, so 100 years, perpetual war, it's beyond most of us to contemplate. The problem is it was quite easy with these countries that didn't have defenses, but now we are looking at the last 3 or 4, including the main one, of course, Russia, which has, a couple thousand nuclear missiles. I think it's not a couple thousand, but it's like 1,000 on trigger alert, just as we have on them. And even if a few hundred of these nuclear bombs go off, it creates a global winter. And even if we don't get a direct hit, it's pretty much the end of human civilization. And so we are looking now at confronting Russia and China. Trump is doing that through trade wars, but Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. Those are kind of like the last 4 that are out there that are either not in our umbrella or in the Mideast. And these are not the same as, we've kind of gotten so lax about it because it's been so cost-free. But what we're looking at now in this very dangerous time is actually not cost-free. This is really, really dangerous stuff to be talking about. And during the Cold War, we all had to go under the desk. How many people had to practice? I was the last of the baby boomers, I think, or I was towards the... I'm in the middle of the baby boomers, I think. But anyways, we had to practice. So it was one of the last times you had a siren going off, and you were supposed to get under your desk. And people were quite aware at the time of the danger of having these nuclear bombs on trigger alert. That's why Reagan, to his credit, and Gorbachev really came to their senses and reduced it. It's why Kennedy... John F. Kennedy finally listened not to the crazy Curtis LeMay warhawks that were telling him to bomb Cuba, but he listened to the 1 or 2 sane voices at that table. Because it looks like, you're going to start this and nobody can end it once these things go off. And we just don't have the political will right now. The American people, I'm really dismayed. I was much more of an activist. Here's my, I was an activist. That's me there standing behind the flag. And we used to, I always said, okay, we stood out on a corner, and I said, we're going to put it in question marks so we can make people think. And actually, sometimes cars would slow down, and they'd try to answer the questions. But I was actually a little more of an activist, 17 years ago and 10 years ago, whatever. As we're getting more and more along, I really am having a hard time myself in losing hope about this. because it just seems like no matter what president, no matter who votes in, it doesn't matter the party. This war, McCain, you know, his legacy, he might be right, 100-year war, but he won't be right if it turns into a nuclear holocaust. And his legacy, you know, he won't even have anyone to glorify his legacy if, in fact, he gets what he wanted, which was this all-out war. So, yeah, 9/11. 9/11 is the things you might have read or seen about it, and the media establishment, mostly not true. To this day, we don't know a lot of things. To this day, there's still a lot of murky parts of it. I just watched, I'm going to stop here, but I just watched a video called, it's called 9/11, Follow the Money. And so, have you seen this one? It's got 2 million people have seen it. It's the Corbett report, and it was done in 2015. It's got a lot of people that have seen it. And that's pretty well documented about how much money was traded, insider trading, and they all made unprecedented amounts of money. Maybe somebody knew that 9/11 was going to happen, because all of a sudden they had all of these trades, and people, they called them put. They were betting against United and American and stuff, and they made all this money. So this is a good video. It's about an hour long. But that's just one of the areas to this day that was never investigated. You know, or if it was investigated, it wasn't investigated very well. So thanks for listening, and I have more in my pieces, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
And I have the mic, and because this program is being filmed, I'd really appreciate it if people use the mic to ask questions. Could somebody over there under the light switches just push up on the rheostat so we can get light? Who has a question? I'll bring you the mic. Okay, I'm going to do my best. It's not so easy because there's people sitting down, but I see a couple of questions.
One of the things, I think we've lost the moral compass, and I don't know if I'm correct in this, but I think all but one of the hijackers was Saudi Arabia. And I think we have sold out to oil. That whole thing of losing the moral compass, we're just in a mire, a swamp.
There's a couple of points about this. 15 of the 19 were Saudis. The other 4 were United Arab Emirates. I think one was Libyan. Do you know what the other 4 were that were not Saudi? Okay, let me think. Oh, Egyptian. Atta was Egyptian. So 4 of them were not Saudi, but that they were all in this Wahhabi persuasion, which is Saudi Arabia is the place this originated, this extreme, you know, very fundamentalist form. And the other thing you mentioned is the moral compass. What I've noticed also is that the ability through propaganda to persuade people that we are doing the moral thing. It goes back to Vietnam, where they said we have to bomb the village to save it. And so if it was Robert Delahunt was coming, he would probably be a good one to bring up the ticking time bomb hypothetical on torture, because this whole group of people that decided to authorize torture believed in this ends justify the means form of ethics, utilitarian ethics. And there's actually 2 forms of utilitarian ethics, but the one form is that you concoct a happy ending, a good goal. It's like Vietnam. If your goal is to liberate people, if your goal is to get information to find the ticking time bomb to save lives in New York City, so what you're doing is you're positing or concocting this real great outcome, and then rationalizing backwards despite facts and saying, well, now the ends justify the means because you have this great goal. And so that's, you know, we had actually a St. Thomas ethicist write about this. I've been in panels fighting with utilitarian ethicists that said torture is ethical, and that's their moral compass, because they in their heads they're creating this good outcome. Ends justify the means. So that's a problem we do it too with humanitarian war principles. Right now, under Obama, they found that this was kind of really seductive to people, because they say they're fighting for human rights. And Samantha Power has written books about this, ending genocide, whatever. But the problem is it's a self-appointment of the United States that gets to determine, as a policeman of the world, where is a genocide that we get to. Well, bombing Libya was like this. Bombing Libya was justified by Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power, and Susan Rice, 3 women who actually convinced the males. The Defense Secretary Gates didn't want to bomb Libya. But it was the 3 females who overpowered, and they used humanitarian, it's called right to protect, claiming that they had to protect the people in Benghazi, and that's why we had to bomb Libya. It's the same as bombing the village to save it, exactly. And that's very good point about the moral compass.
This gentleman has a question.
Yes, in the fall of 1999, Bill Clinton talks in his memoir about causing him to have in December, fearful of a bombing someplace on the first of the new century, have him meet every morning with all the intelligence heads, meet and talk to one another, break down the walls, which they did. But a few months later, George Bush, they had a lot of chatter on the internet and radio in the summer of '01. He was in Texas, and he met once, I think, with his CIA guy, but that's all. There was no example followed on that point.
Exactly. That lead up to the change of the millennium, there were a lot of warnings that even our computers would fail, and that because of the clock and everything. And our FBI analysts wrote a big document called Megiddo or something like that. The title was from Israel, but it was about fanatics that would try to lead a charge in Israel. Megiddo was the title of it, and it was circulated. And there was a lot of emphasis and concern. I spent the night of New Year's Eve, a whole bunch of us were in the office that night waiting for something to happen. So that's exactly right. And they caught a terrorist coming down from Canada that was going to bomb the Los Angeles airport. And probably they caught that person. It was a very astute female customs officer who noticed something wrong about the guy. But maybe some of this overemphasis on things probably was in the backdrop of her head. And so she stops him and she finds out. So, and you'll often find that's the case, with detecting actual, not fake terrorism, not entrapments that they do a lot of these, close to entrapping where they coerce vulnerable people to, say that they're going to press a bomb or something. I'm not talking about that. The real ones that they have caught, the shoe bomber, the underwear bomber, the Times Square bomber, you know who caught them? Not the CIA, not the NSA, not the FBI. People caught all of these. And so if you keep it quiet that there's all this intelligence, the 9/11 Commission actually said they failed to share the information with the public. We get when I was working, I retired in 2004, but all the people that are in government get pressured to keep all this secret. I have friends that were whistleblowers that knew airline security was lax. In fact, one of my friends, Bogdan, the one I co-authored WikiLeaks in 9/11, with an FAA red team. He was the red team leader, and his name's Bogdan Djokovic. And he found out that Logan Airport, which is one of the airports that the hijackers came through, had lax security. They were able to smuggle weapons on, et cetera, et cetera. He could not get anyone to listen to him about that. And then he tried to become a whistleblower after 9/11, and it was totally squashed. They put him in a closet counting paper clips for the rest of his career. Yeah, and so he and I wrote this article because this is the problem. The public actually needs to know information in order to protect itself. When you're trying to catch a fugitive, America's Most Wanted. Do they keep it secret when they're looking for a dangerous fugitive? There was a killer that came through Minnesota when I was working in '97 called Andrew Cunanan, and he was killing people. He killed like 5 or 6 people, and I was our office spokesperson on it. And what did we do? First thing that we did, we got all these photos of him in looking different things, and we put it out to the whole country because we wanted to stop him. And you know what? Keeping it secret wasn't going to help. We had to have people looking for him. That was the whole thing up behind America's Most Wanted. The same thing is true with these warnings and stuff. Before the millennium, I think everybody was quite aware of the fact that some things could happen. And it didn't. You know, it was good that it didn't happen. And then all of this dropped afterwards. Our acting FBI director, Picard, his name was Picard, and he was retired in June of 2001. And then we had an acting director before Robert Mueller came on 1 week before 9/11. So in that meantime of the key 2 months leading up to 9/11, there was an acting director, Picard. And in the 9/11 Commission, he testified and told them that he tried to get Ashcroft to be concerned about terrorism. And Ashcroft told him, I don't want to hear another word about terrorism. And that's actually in the 9/11 Commission. He tried a few times, to warn him, and then Ashcroft, just said, I don't want to hear about it. Ashcroft, in August, placed violent crime as his #1 priority, and terrorism was almost the bottom of his priorities.
We have a question way back here.
Okay.
Yes, there was a really interesting front line. You've probably seen it on John O'Neill. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned connecting the dots. Well, from what I saw in there, he didn't even need the CIA. He was connecting the dots. Yeah. And he had a great intelligence network out of Yemen. However, everything that he was doing was basically just squashed by Louis Freeh. Had he been allowed to do his work, what's your thought? That could have made a big difference, I think.
Yeah, I didn't know John O'Neill personally, but I know of him quite well. And like everyone, he's kind of a mixed bag. And one of the reasons why Louis Freeh probably didn't like him or came not to like him and eventually forced him to resign. He did leave his briefcase with classified documents in a hotel room, but they forced him. But you know what? Probably a lot of people do that, and they don't have hardly minor punishment for something like that. Louis Freeh forced him to resign from the FBI just a few weeks before 9/11, and he got a job as the World Trade Center security head, and on the day of, he ran back into the building and died. It's incredible. He was the head of the only unit in the FBI that was working on Al-Qaeda in New York City. And I would say it probably wasn't just him alone. There's an agent who's actually spoken here a couple of times, once at Walter Mondale's Humphrey Institute. His name is Ali Soufan. And Ali Soufan became a whistleblower because he was the guy who was first interviewing the terrorist suspects when they were caught. He got information from them. And then this lie occurred that we have to start torturing the CIA. But Ali Soufan worked on the same squad as John O'Neill. And in Yemen, it was Ali Soufan. Well, he was only one of 7 agents who spoke a little Arabic. He is a Lebanese American, and he spoke Arabic. So he had almost solved the Cole bombing, Ali Soufan. And of course, John O'Neill, there was another agent in there by the last name of Clunan, but there were a few of them that were the only agents that really were working hard on Al-Qaeda. Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that Louis Freeh probably made him resign was he didn't approve of his personal lifestyle. John O'Neill had a very racy personal with womanizing and drinking and things like that. And so and Louis Freeh was this kind of very squared away, Catholic and whatever. So, they had a difference of personalities, and they had friction. But going back to this torture thing, when Ali Soufan realized that we were going down that road and we were going to start torturing, he called back. Now, of course, John O'Neill was no longer there, but he called straight to the head of the New York office, a guy named Pat DeMuro, and he said, what is going on? What is this? We're going to go down this. We're going to be torturing. And DeMuro then called up Mueller, and they decided that the FBI would not participate. So of all of the agencies that went along with this, now, one of our agents stayed and watched it. I mean, Soufan left. He didn't even stay to watch it. But the other agent stayed and, witnessed it or whatever. But so, there were some good agents, and John O'Neill had figured out a lot of things. He wasn't the only one, because he had a good squad of people, including Soufan, that was working on it.
This gentleman has a call.
As I recall, there was almost an attack in Paris that preceded the 9/11 bombing that the French security people caught and prevented. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And then do you have an approximate time that was?
Yeah, I think it was to fly into the Eiffel Tower. And again, Al-Qaeda wanted to always do these dramatic, spectacular things before they just became, before it devolved into ISIS where you're beheading and whatever. The whole point is to grab people's emotions. And so by having a spectacular thing, this idea of flying into the Eiffel Tower, there's another one besides that, which was the ringleader of Al-Qaeda that planned all of this is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had a nephew by the last name of Rassam. Am I right? Rassam? Yeah, I think it's Rassam. And he had the similar idea of flying a plane into CIA headquarters. And these were all in the years, I can't give you the exact thing, but a couple of years before 9/11. He eventually got caught, but there was a plan, also a plan with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his nephew to put bombs on like 12 airliners at the same time. And by luck, I think it was in the Philippines, an apartment fire started, and they stopped the fire, and they found all these plans. It was called the Bojinka conspiracy, but Al-Qaeda was planning to put bombs on 12 airliners simultaneously, as well as flying. Now, I will just say one thing. We don't know exactly what Moussaoui was researching, but he had all of these wind patterns on his computer. His laptop had things like that. And there's some evidence, I can't really tell you place it exactly, but there's some evidence that they were also thinking about flying into a nuclear plant. And I'm skeptical. Our nuclear plants tell you that the concrete is so thick that even if a jetliner flew in, it would not go off. It would not set a nuclear chain reaction and meltdown and all that. They say that, but I am not so sure if a plane hitting the right place in a nuclear plant. And I think there's some evidence that they had a few different plans like this, and then they ended up doing just like the easy things like the underwear bomber and the shoe bomber. Those became the less dramatic and less mass casualties, but still pretty significant. And now they've gone to driving cars. ISIS just rents a truck or a car and drives into a crowd. And I'll tell you what, really hard to prevent somebody from renting a car or truck and driving into a crowd anywhere. Yeah. That's the newest.
Yeah. I'm just trying to connect some of the dots of what you're saying. And you were talking about this connection between the Saudi elite and the Bush family, and this whole reluctance to pay attention to the fact that this might happen. And then the connection to let's have perpetual wars. And are you really suggesting that there was some kind of loose or conspiracy to let this happen so that we could use it as a pretext?
I'll go with the term that the agent in our office who testified in the Moussaoui case, he was the main witness, one of the main witnesses. His name's Harry Samet. His name is not secret because he testified. And he called it criminal negligence. He goes, I think that's the best way to describe what I saw happening. And now he's only talking about the Moussaoui case, but criminal negligence. And I agree. I think that some of it was just negligent. Negligence, by the way, if there's an attorney out here, you know that if it's just failure to shovel your sidewalk and someone slips, you'll be negligent and that party can sue you. But the police won't come and arrest you for mere negligence. Now, the other one that everybody thinks of is deliberate intent. And deliberate intent, you know, if it's a murder, it's what we think. We see all the murder mysteries, it's always cold-blooded, pre-planned, not even passion. It's always that other one where somebody is really, you know, trying to get the insurance proceeds, deliberate, real intent and deliberate. I think what I know about 9/11 is in this middle area called recklessness. And that's when it should have been foreseeable. And in this case, there's a lot of reasons why this was foreseeable. And then failure to deal with it, and even though it's foreseeable. And recklessness, that's the same as somebody who's drunk, you know, has drunk too much and gets in their car and whatever. They didn't intend to hit somebody head on or whatever. But if they've got themselves so drunk and got in their car, they're going to be held guilty criminally for recklessness. And I think a lot of it borders on reckless, you know, from what I know. And I also know that these motivations, it's like follow the money, but there's more than that. Because keeping good foreign policy, I shouldn't even say good, but the foreign policy that the United States has long been involved in, every president, whatever, is at odds with reducing terrorism, because there are other goals there. Oil and resources and control and having other governments that we can basically, you know, tell them what to do. There's all these other goals that are conflicting with reducing terrorism. And I don't want to explain that. You know, we should be allowed to vote on this and say, well, is this what we want, or do we want, you know, to reduce terrorism and have more peace in the world, etc. But we're not allowed. We're made to believe that we're reducing terrorism when we're not. And and making money is another whole part of this. Most of the officials that are involved in this, sure, I could just name the whole list of these neoconservative war hawks, all have made hand-over-fist money. And they go back and forth, portray us revolving door between these big military contractors and whatever, and they go back and forth, and they're making hand-over-fist money because there's no limit to the military budget right now because people are scared. So our Congress, there's not even a debate when the trillions come up to have an extra $100 billion, even over what the Pentagon asked for, and there's not even a debate about it, hardly a debate. There's like maybe a handful of senators and congressmen who even bring up the problem. And the people are so scared that they think it's politically feasible, and yes, a lot of people are making money. By the way, the Pope said that, not me. That was something the Pope said.
We've got just a few more minutes.
Okay, so I'll make it very quick. Thanks for this great introduction, Coleen, but needless to say, because of time constraints, you really started the story at 9/11, which is appropriate, you know, being it was 17 years ago, and I was on active duty at the time. So if I may add a little bit, just from my own perspective as an Army officer and in Guantanamo defense attorney, with 9/11, immediately an assault on the Constitution began by the Bush administration, Cheney, and they implemented things, as you mentioned, martial law earlier. They issued an order that the military now has jurisdiction in the United States, which is in effect martial law itself. But going back before, and the FBI came out with the Intercept pointing out that they now have stopped hiding the fact that the motivation for terrorism is our own foreign policy. So I'm going to ask a question here in a minute, but just to point out a couple things. Wesley Clark, General Wesley Clark, is on YouTube pointing out that we had a target list of 7 nations that we were going to take down one after another, and that was immediately brought out upon 9/11. It wasn't conceived upon 9/11, it was brought out, it had been conceived long before by Project for New American Century, this neoconservative outfit. But another point to be made, and Basevich has made this, is that the Cheney Doctrine began in 1992, which held, when Cheney was Secretary of State, he and Paul Wolfowitz dreamed up the scheme that with the end of the Cold War, that the United States now had hegemony over the entire world. And they issued a paper that was leaked, and they had to withdraw it, but as the co-writer of it acknowledged, they didn't change the meaning. And so, as an Army officer, I once had a paper cross my desk saying, it's getting there, saying that our policy, and this was probably in 2002, before the Iraq War, our policy as a military was to not allow anyone else other nation to have even the ability to cause us to hesitate in our decision making as a military. That's how totalitarian it was. So I guess my point, and I'll bring this to a quick close, is perhaps you could comment on the fact that our perpetual war was conceived of long before 9/11 by Cheney and these neoconservatives. And now people, you mentioned, well, we don't see the cost, but we are now really seeing it now because we are cutting domestic spending to shift that over into the Department of Defense. Okay. So comment, please, on why people might want to be considering more why these costs, when we cut domestic spending, shifting it in the military.
There are costs. Even though the costs have been made invisible to Americans, there are costs. And, there's so many, I don't really have time to list them, but even, for instance, the mass shootings. To be honest, this militarism, to get people to be recruited into the military, and it's like 3 times more likely that a mass shooter is military. Even the guy the kid that shot in Florida was in the ROTC training. He was the marksman. He was a marksman in the ROTC training in high school. So the military has long recognized that video, these violent Call of Duty, how many people know what I'm talking about? You have kids? I caught my 11-year-old son after getting his Christmas money, and he's sitting in front of the screen with blood. It actually splatters blood-looking things on the screen, Call of Duty. The Newtown shooter was a violent video game addict. There's a whole lot of that. And the military, this is good for recruiting because getting people hooked on this, and now you say, well, I'm really good at shooting on the screen, I might as well go into the military. And it's become more difficult as time has gone on. They have to offer bonuses for a drone pilot who enlists, they have to enlist for 10 years, but they get an additional bonus on top of their regular, really high salary of $400,000. Because drone piloting, even though it's cost-free, very safe for the person just pressing the button, it's debilitating. We know some people who were in the drone assassination program, that there's a movie about it actually, and they become debilitated because what are they doing? They're sitting there all day long looking through these things and hitting people. So it's hard to keep them up. The costs of PTSD, the costs of just the war itself, and now the notion that we have to cut infrastructure, social programs. And so even though it's $21 trillion, what's been cut are the social programs. What isn't being cut is the military, and that continues to rise.
We are really running out of time, which is too bad. I know lots of people have questions still. Perhaps after we formally end the program at 2:30, if you want to linger, and if Coleen Rowley is willing to take more questions.
Yeah, I'll stay.
Okay, this lady gets the honor of the last question.
You've presented us with lots of problems. What is your solution?
Beautiful.
Well, it's a no-brainer. And you see all the presidents, by the way, this is such a no-brainer that the presidents after the Bush administration, even the Bush administration to a little bit, all promise when they're campaigning that they're going to reduce military spending and they're going to, Obama promised to end the Iraq war. He promised to close Guantanamo. Trump promised that he would get us out of Syria. So it's a no-brainer. This has to be reduced. We're kind of doing this empire thing, which is exactly what the Soviet Union did, and this is one of the reasons why. In all empires, they first of all, when they get so overextended, they rot from the inside. That's some of the problem right now. And they are caught up in this expensive effort to control too much territory and too much land. So you should learn the lesson of history. Read Andrew Bacevich. It's not hard. These are not hard solutions. But you have to, for instance, martial law, this has to be rescinded. Somebody has to go back. The only memo that I know that was rescinded was the final torture memo of John Yoo. All the other memos are horrible too. But the ACLU ran out of energy. And so those should all be looked at, and most of them should be rescinded when they start saying the Constitution is now we're in war, and the president has all power during a time of war, etc. All of those should be turned back in. You can go right down the list with war powers and all the rest, and maybe not overnight, but little by little, we could get back to normal if we did this. We are not doomed to now go into a nuclear confrontation with Russia and China, for heaven's sakes. And that's what it's looking like.
Thank you very much, Coleen Rowley. As I say, if you do have additional questions and Ms. Rowley is able to stay, please, I'm sorry we didn't get to as many questioners as I'd like to. And come back next week for the Constitution as a historical document. Thank you.